no secret that hair is important when it comes to the world of appearances. I'm not saying that your hairstyle is what makes you beautiful, but it definitely will either enhance or mar your natural beauty. Hairstyle also can play a role in the world of business. Depending on your hairstyle, you may present yourself either a bum or a professional. Without realizing it, our hairstyles tie into many different parts of culture and society. It plays a role in politics sometimes, music, style, jobs, etc. Depending on the rest of society's developments, social structures, etc., style along with hairstyles and grooming change. We will be looking at 100 years of men's haircuts in this video, covering both the best and the worst decades for men's hairstyles. Let us begin. In 1910, the hairstyles were very refined and formal. Most hairstyles were short on both the sides and the top, either parted directly down the middle of the head, or sometimes a deep side part on either the right or left side. Their hair was heavily oiled and combed back from the forehead all the way to the back of the head. Even the very short cut sides were oiled back. Sorry to interrupt, but doesn't this guy really look like Joaquin Phoenix? Do you see the relation? Anyways, let's get back. This oiled look mainly only applied to the men with center parts, not for a far right or left side part. The classic side part hairstyle was for the low-fuss gentlemen who didn't want to go through the strenuous process required for parting your hair down the center, which required a lot of oil and styling. Another reason to get a side part haircut was because oils were very messy, and they often damaged hats and some furniture. For both haircuts, though, the sides were cut short, only a few inches above the ears. For the most part, the hairstyle stayed the same into the 1920s, with the oil-based side or center part and slicked back hair. A few differences, however, were made. One, instead of the hair being mostly the same length, now the hair was much shorter on the sides than it was on the top. Two, and I cannot exaggerate this more, that a clean-shaven face was essential. A small mustache was permitted, but very small, nothing too big. But for the most part, men kept their faces, including their necks, clean and entirely shaven. Men with curly hair would most likely pay attention to the undercut, adding sheen and oil to their curls. Men's hair was not too short or too long. It was cut at a very appropriate length. The hair length for men was usually 4 to 5 inches so that it could be smoothed back or simply long enough to extend back over the crown of the head without it being too long to hang over the peak of their heads. Personally, I think this was definitely one of the golden decades for men hairstyles. Nothing too bizarre, if you know what I mean. I'm referring to you, 1980s mullet. Men's hairstyles in the 1910s and 1920s, as we have already reviewed, required a heavy oil use, deep right or left side parts, and a little longer look. This took a turn, however, in the 30s when what we call classic men's short haircuts today were introduced and quickly became very popular. The center part was no longer popular, but now just side parts were. The top of the hair was longer and styled in a way that would best style each individual man's face. Men's hairstyles in the 1930s were broader on the sides and softer on the top than in previous decades, with shining jazz hair being replaced by more matte products in mid-30s. No longer was hair mostly slicked back completely, but now it was slicked back at an angle, allowing longer sides. Wavy hair also became popular, especially among the younger generation of men. Young men, blessed with natural thick hair, curls, waves, could easily pull off their tussle top. Like the short haircut just mentioned, the sides were tapered, but the top was long and free. They also wore oil on their longer, thick curls to make it shiny, less frizzy, and keep the hair out of their face. Although an occasional strand would hang down on the forehead, or in this case, very curly hair, many strands. The ladies roll over this.
When I tell you this man is so fine, when I tell you this man is scrumptious, he make me wanna, oh God.
More casual look. The tussle look was very popular among athletes, surfers, artists, musicians, and college kids. The conch also became increasingly popular amongst African American men, even though it was a very hard look to accomplish. In the 30s, the conch was the primary hairstyle for African American men. The hairstyle involved using lye to chemically straighten the naturally curly hair of blacks and then styling it with conventional 1930s part wave. The conch left the hair shiny, limiting the need for oil, which was an essential hair product for men's hair during those decades. It was a painful process that not many talked about, and it was not good for your hair, but people really just didn't care.
How do you know what's good for me? That's my opinion!
People would call it jazz hair. Most men had only one general haircut during the 1940s, short on the sides and back and long on the top. Personally, I think this look is super cute. I know this is a history documentary and I probably shouldn't be that opinionated, but I think we must also take time to honor the noteworthy years. I mean, look at these fine men, definitely noteworthy. The 1940s men had perfectly groomed hair, but often had to take frequent visits to the barber in order to get for the sides to stay well trimmed. The 40s hair drastically changed from the 30s, being that in the 30s, short-cut hair was all the rage, where in the 40s, long, smooth back waves were very popular. One of the main differences in this decade from the last is that the center part was no longer ever used, being that it now was considered a more feminine look. As the 40s progressed, so did the waves and height of the hair. Layers of waves, loose waves, or sculpted waves and curls required only little product to hold the shape, being that the free and casual was more in. In the late 40s, the oil look was no longer trendy. While the early 40s were heavily polished, the late 40s had a freer looseness that still took an effort to style and maintain. The 1950s dawned a new age of men's hairstyles, exploding in popularity and variety. Okay, maybe they couldn't do that though. Now men could do all sorts of different things with their hair, including dyeing it, permanently waving it, or the term is called perm, or even sometimes they would purchase wigs, although it was very rare for them. Celebrity wig wearing, though, in the 50s was very popular. The varieties and lengths and style greatly contrasted with previous decades. This new decade included a lot of different options. Here are a few of the most popular options of that time. As one of the most popular hairstyles of that decade, the 1950s newly introduced crew cut had many different styling methods and variations that ultimately developed into their own iconic hairstyles. A crew cut is defined as having the top of the hair cut short and the sides tapered shorter in any way that best complemented the structure of the man's face. Another very popular hairstyle that was born in the 50s was the flat top. The flat tops were considered cool. This flat top haircut was probably the most popular haircut of that time. Like the name says, the defining feature is the cut flat hair on the top of the head. The haircut required lots of styling and hair products to maintain its squarey shape. For African Americans, the conked hairdos were still all the rage, but this soon would change. Another popular hairstyle was the breaker haircut, which used a lot of styling and product to create those pristine, sleek waves. This hairstyle required longer hair at the top of the head and took quite a while to get it right. Because it was very popular among celebrities and Hollywood figures, it soon was renamed as the Hollywood cut. A not-so-worthy mention is the elephant trunk.
Yes. Are you going to finish that croissant?
Which was basically just a pompadour, and I think this one basically explains itself. It was also called a jelly roll, understandably.
Please, no! 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 No!
1960s men's haircuts and hairstyles encompasses two opposite extremes and just about everything in between. On one end of this extreme was the classic well-groomed side part, which was so popular from 40s to 60s, whereas on the other side was the long-haired, bearded hippie protester.
There's a mushroom on your shirt. Oh, I'm a failure.
The hippie lifestyle was all about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, or in other terms, it was a carefree life. This new carefree hippie look gave way to rapid change and new experimental looks. The sleek business look quickly evolved into something longer, shaggier, messier, and lots of bangs, which fell in front of men's faces. However, this rugged look was just the beginning of what was to come in the next few decades, and it just kept getting worse.
When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
It may be hard to believe now, but long hair on a man in the 60s was quite a statement. It went so far against the grain that it scared many people, and when combined with hippie ideals, as they transformed the late 1960s, long hair became a symbol that many Americans despised. However, even if it was scarce, it did give way to men's hairstyles in the next decade, where long hair became extremely popular. The thing about the haircut was that it had no particular or real standard. In fact, it was a deliberate lack of care for style and civility, which was the very purpose of the hairstyle. Hair was grown however long an individual desired, with little to none grooming or stylization. For African Americans, the conch was the iconic hairstyle for a few decades in a row, until that all changed in the 1960s, when the Black is Beautiful movement arose. Perhaps the most notorious and memorable hairstyle of the 1960s was the Afro. The Afro did exist before the 1960s, but gained more popularity during the 60s and extreme popularity during the 70s. The Afro was an expression of self and celebration of race and heritage. In the 70s, the Afro was as much about being fashionable as it was political. It was worn by both sexes and was a statement of Black pride. It was styled by using a wide-toothed comb, picking up the hair skyward, trying to shape it into a ball. It wanted that puffy look that resembled an easy hairstyle, which was all the rage in the 70s. The 70s men's hair incorporated more length, layers, and texture for a natural, freeing look. In the 70s, men's grooming and styling of hair became trendy, meaning more male hair products and tools were being sold. This free look included the Afro, the feather look, the perm, and sadly, the mullet. Yes, the mullet, even though it was very rare in the 70s, this era still does mark its birth. Speaking of the hippies from the 60s, their influence on individual expressment and style carried into the 70s, meaning that long, casual hairstyles now became extremely popular. One noteworthy, very popular hairstyle in the 70s was the shag hairstyle. Plenty of guys were walking around with shaggy haircuts since the style was on trend and cool at the time. Some were ugly and some were passable. The perm, yes. The 80s produced this iconic look, and for all those who do not know what a perm is, putting your hair in waves or curls and then treating it with chemicals so that the style lasts for several months. Today, the perm tight coils have evolved into something more natural and less dense look. The 80s was all about minimal effort. Here is a list of the most iconic 80s do's. A look that was in, especially for rap and hip-hop artists, was the high top fade. This high top fade looked so smooth and textured that it continued into the 90s with Will Smith in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Using a clean fade on the sides and of the face and a lot of added volume on the top, this hairdo definitely was one that made a statement. A more edgy look that some people went for were spiky hairstyles. The spiky hairstyles were doable for most any length, although shorter hair looked better. The 80s version of spiked hair most often included frosted tips or blonde bleach. As I have already mentioned before, the mullet, which was introduced in the 70s, didn't really become that popular until the 80s. It had long hair all over with considerably longer hair and the back, characterizing the classic mullet hairstyle. Business in the front, party in the back is another term for it. We must take a moment of silence to pay homage to my man, Mel Gibson, who is one of the few, if not the only man, to ever pull off the challenging look. Some notable mentions include Chuck Norris and Brad Pitt, although we all know he could do a lot better. Some not-so-worthy mentions include Billy Ray Cyrus, Peter Dinklage, Hulk Hogan.
Oh, no.
David Bowie, etc.
Questions. Because I don't want to. No, permission denied. Next, you have been stopped.
The list continues. Anyways, enough about mullets. A very low-maintenance haircut called the buzz cut suited several face types and was for those who didn't want to have to take care of long hair. And lastly, the mohawk also was born in the 80s. This look was accomplished by cutting the sides all the way down to the skin and leaving one strip of very long hair in the middle, which required extreme styling. This was definitely one of the more striking head-turning looks of the 80s. As decades went by, from the start of 1910, men began to have more options that were still considered trendy. I will name some of the most popular and iconic haircuts from this era. As one of the most popular haircuts for men and boys in the 90s, curtains were worn by many young celebrities. Wow, Johnny Depp. Dang, what did we miss? Anyways, this look is flowy, relaxed look that can also be made formal if slicked back or styled to the side. One of the most iconic cuts from the 90s was the bowl cut. What defines the bowl cut is bangs, which are cut to the same length as the rest of the hair and left to hang over the forehead in the front. Even though the look does not require too much effort, when cut tidy and formal, men could wear this versatile haircut to look well while not putting in much effort. The Caesar haircut originated from the man himself. Caesar became very popular, especially among celebrities. The defining feature of the short haircut is the lower fringe, which guys would style forward and down to cover part of the forehead. For African American men, cornrows were all the rage. Cornrows were not only low maintenance, but also very trendy. The cornrow became very popular among celebrities and rappers. I think it is also good to know that many of the 80s haircuts carried their way into the 90s, and haircuts like the mullet, the mohawk, the flat top, and slicked back hair were all still in. Again, Johnny Depp. Who knew? What was the biggest hairstyle for men during this decade? That's a hard question to answer, being that there was no defining haircuts trends during this decade, since almost everything was in or simply just acceptable. The low maintenance theme from the 90s carried into this decade as well, being that most men wore their hair either long and shaggy or buzz. However, there still are a few hairstyles that are worth mentioning, especially for their quality to stand out. Firstly, originally inspired from the 80s mohawk, the Fox Mohawk is a versatile style allowing guys to work a trendy look without being over the top. This style had no real restriction or regulations since it can be either long or short. The hair is cut to form a bit of a point on the top, but is still left long enough in order for the style to also be worn conservatively. Probably one of the most iconic, if not the most, was the emo cut. The trend is characterized by long razored bangs, black dye, and rough texture. The style often resembled punk music, but most punk artists at that time sported this look. One of the more considered hot trends of the 20th century was the textured cut. For the spicy cut, the hair was normally cut aggressively short on the sides and back, while aggressive texturing was added to the top, which is far greater length. I don't know if it's just because I lived in this decade, but most of the haircuts in the 2010s are way more handsome than the previous decades. This decade has haircuts like the undercut, the John Travolta hairstyle, pompadour, etc. Yes, the indomitable pompadour had a comeback. The difference between with modern pompadour versus previous decade versions is that the modern pompadour had a side parting and the hair on the sides were slicked back. It doesn't look too overdone, but made sure that men sporting this looked gorgeous. One haircut that became very popular kind of looked like an Elvis and John Travolta hairstyle. The hair in this hairstyle was pulled in front, and then using pomade or stronghold gel, it was curled. The sides are shorter and can be flicked back. Another look, more like just a messy look, was one where men grew out their bangs and pushed them to one side, while the rest of their hair is almost like a bedhead look, but apparently it is very hard to achieve. You have to use a lot of product and styling and stuff. Well, thank you everyone for watching my documentary. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you walk away knowing a lot about men's hair history. Shout out to my editor Zeke here, who spent hours working on this documentary. I love him. We go way, way back. You should also mention that he's my brother. So anyways, round of applause to him, and see you. Thanks for joining me. Bye.